Hello and welcome to the Banker's coverage of Davos. I'm here with the editor of the Banker magazine, Brian Kaplan. My name is Geraldine Lamb. I'm the Capital Markets and Investment Banking editor. So Brian, we've been obviously through a dreadful economic period and before that the financial crisis. Do you think we're out of the woods yet? Do you think that the Davos discussion is going to be focused very much on economic recovery?
Well, I think it's going to be a very mixed mood at Davos. Obviously last year we were in the throes of the crisis and there was a very somber mood at Davos. But I think that the delegates will feel that the world has been saved from a Great Depression and the banks have been bailed out. So those are two positives. But as we start to reflect on where we are economically, there are huge challenges ahead. And the worry at the moment is that another asset bubble is building up. We've had a period of very low interest rates. We've seen asset prices recover really out of sync with the recovery we've seen in the economy. And now there's a big worry about sovereign indebtedness and whether that could cause the next crisis.
There's rising debt amongst sovereigns and it's becoming an increasing worry. How do you think the whole sovereign issue is going to play out this year?
I think there will be a huge focus on indebtedness in sovereigns, which is something that we've covered in the January issue of the Banker, which is going to be distributed at the conference. The European Central Bank Governor Jean-Claude Trichet, who's always very prominent at Davos, has just given Greece a warning that it needs to get its house in order, and there's concerns about whether Greece could default on its debts. It has very high ratios of debt to gross domestic product. But it's not the only country, and the UK and the US also are clocking out very high levels of debt. And economists generally think that if you get over 90% of debt to GDP ratio, that somehow impinges on your growth prospects and makes recovery from there very difficult. And of course Davos is unique because you have representatives from every country in the world almost at presidential and prime ministerial level. So they'll definitely be focusing on their own individual debt positions. And the worry, of course, is that unlike previous crises where it was very much Latin American countries or emerging market countries that had high debt levels, the big debt levels now are to be found in the advanced countries in Europe and the United States. Economists generally feel that if a country has a debt to gross domestic product ratio which is higher than 90%, that then impinges on its growth prospects going forward. And there's quite a number of countries that are in that position now. And you have, in Europe, you have Greece, Italy, Ireland, that all have very troubling and high levels of debt. The bond markets are worried that Greece might default. And the UK and the US are getting themselves into the same kind of precarious position. And there needs to be a real plan on deficit reduction and spending cuts or tax rises to show the markets the way out. And I expect this to be the centre of a big debate at Davos on what really is sustainable in terms of debt and whether the debt indebtedness that we find in the world economy at the moment could impinge on the recovery.
Do you think China will be under discussion at Davos this year? I mean, it's just come out with fantastic export figures, biggest in the world, but it does now have a massive inflation spike, and of course the government did pump a lot of money through the banks into the economic system. How do you think that's going to play out this year?
No, I think there are some real concerns about China and the other BRICS that, I mean, China managed to keep its economy growing at 7 or 8% through the crisis, but it did that by a huge amount of infrastructure spending and a very loose monetary policy. And we've seen massive asset price increases in China now. We've seen house prices go up 60% in the space of a year. The Chinese authorities have tried to calm things down a little bit. They've raised capital ratios for the banks. But the economist Peter Tasker was saying recently that he feared that China was facing the same kind of bubble conditions that brought down Japan in the 1980s. So economists and business people generally have been relying on the new emerging markets like Brazil, India and China to refloat the world economy. So if they were now to get in trouble themselves, that would be very damaging. And I think this will be a crucial debate at Davos. Of course, Davos isn't only about pure economic issues. It covers a wide variety of issues, and climate change has been one of those issues that's been on the agenda for some years. They were very worried a few years back when they didn't have sufficient snow up in the for the skiing, which normally takes place after the meetings. But we recently had the Copenhagen meeting, which was not regarded as a great success, and I suspect that they will be discussing these kinds of issues. I don't know whether you have a feeling for what kind of path the discussion on climate change might take at Davos.
Well, I think it's mostly going to be about, obviously, the failure of Copenhagen, and the biggest failure was that of uncertainty. Market participants had expected there to be commitments to reduction of emissions, a reform of the clean development mechanism, and certainty given for the cap and trade systems that are already in place, most notably the European Union emissions trading scheme. But the failure of that means that prices were depressed. Critics say there's going to be a lack of investment in the clean development projects that are part of the UN-backed scheme, and that maybe even things like the offsets that are earned by forest preservation may be stalled. So I think most people are very disappointed in the next UN meeting in Mexico. People are very pessimistic that anything will come out of that. That said, some people are quite positive that at least India and China now feel under more pressure than they did before, so they feel that that has been raised on their agenda. And equally, the debate has now reached sort of head of state levels, so this makes it easier for conflict over climate change, trade, and energy to be resolved when the discussion gets to that level. So they feel that may give it some sort of momentum going forward.
And the banks have focused a lot of resources on climate change and carbon trading issues over the last couple of years. Do you think that's going to be a big part of their business going forward? And do you think that might help to repair their rather tarnished image in the public mind if they were able to say, well, we're actually doing something to help the climate change problem?
Well, the debate is very mixed on that. The banks and the UN-backed scheme feel that the cap and trade schemes make a very significant contribution to that. And a lot of environmentalists believe that it does nothing apart from give people permission to pollute. But the biggest cap and trade scheme, which of course is populated largely on the one side by polluters such as the big utilities, and the banks on the other side who help to facilitate trade and create liquidity in the market. At least the positivity out of that is that the biggest scheme and the only real scheme is the European trading system, and that has certainty until 2020, so there is some consistency with that going forward. But the big challenge for that is that it is moving from a free government allocation system to an auction system in 2013. So from that moment, the big polluters, such as the utilities, will have to buy their permits rather than be given them for free by the government. And that means a significant change within the market.
So there's going to be a lot, I think, on the climate change for the Davos delegates to.
And everyone's looking towards the US to see, of course, the legislation is stuck in the US. Legislation went through the House of Representatives last summer, but has got stuck in the Senate behind financial and healthcare reform. So it's being pushed into 2010, and most people fear that if it doesn't get done in Q1, then it will get stuck behind various Senate and Congress elections later in the year and will be pushed into 2011. And without the US, there's very little chance of any kind of global agreement. So,
I mean, one of the interesting things about Davos, of course, is who actually shows up. And we've had some thin years with bankers. In the depths of the crisis, they were a little bit reticent about being there. But maybe this year they're going to show up in their droves and join in the debate on climate change. So we're looking forward to an interesting Davos. So, and we'll be reporting on the results in our February issue.